morning, everyone, and welcome to the CBI at 10. We hope everyone's had something of a weekend, if that's been available to you, and ready now for, can't believe it, the last week of February. I can't work out, Tony, whether or not the time is going very slowly this year or incredibly quickly. It seems to possibly be both. The focus today is going to be on test and trace. We're going to try and really get to understand what's expected and what's possible in workplaces around test and trace. And I'm delighted that Ben Stimpson, who's the Chief Customer Officer for NHS Test and Trace, is joining us, and Lisa Curlip-Harrison, who's the security partner at RWE. Ben and Lisa, we're going to come to you in a moment, but I'm going to start, if I might, with Tony Danker, the Director General of the CBI. As everyone who's a regular on this call will know, the real aim of this is to exchange the information that the CBI is getting in its conversations with government and business, but also to hear from businesses, to hear what the real world experiences are. And Tony, it feels as though today and this next 10 days is critical, isn't it? There's both the beginnings of a roadmap out of lockdown and, of course, the budget. So I just wanted to check in with you on both of those. Should we start with what you think business would like to hear from the Prime Minister tonight?
Yeah, well, look, good morning, everybody. And James, you're right. This is sort of two parts of a two-part plan, and we're only going to get one part today, then we have to wait 10 days. And they are utterly connected, because if you are a business, I think we pretty much know now we're not going to have an overnight reopening, and therefore your financial state for the next few months until you can reopen and get demand back in your business is critical. And so just, you know, a warning, we're all going to be a bit frustrated after today, because we're going to have lots of questions about the viability of our businesses, because we won't know about the financial support package probably for 10 days time, which is a regret, but it is the way of the world. Look, some good news, of course, on vaccination achievement and on actually the early signals of vaccination efficacy, and also on the potential that they really do curb transmission. And those are just both great bits of news. So I think that's a really good backdrop if you're the Prime Minister today. So look, I think what we're expecting is the stuff that's been trailed over the weekend. It's likely to be a step-by-step phased approach. And by the way, I think that is, you know, net good news for business. I think we all want to not go back to stop-start. Now, it's not good news if you're in certain sectors and you're losing money every week. You know, you want things pretty quickly. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. But the idea of a phased approach that gets rid of stop-start is generally welcome. I think the second thing that's welcome is the reopening of schools as a priority. You know, we've been saying on these calls for almost a year now that one of the big lessons of the last year has been how important schools are, not in and of themselves for the life chances of our children, but in order to reopen the economy. And if anyone's been engaged in homeschooling for the last 8 weeks, then you will agree with that, no doubt. Look, what are we hoping for today? Three things really. And then some stuff after today. So the three things I think we want today, one is as much clarity of planning as possible. So sequencing and trigger points, what comes when, and what are the well-known now phrase data not dates, what are the data points that trigger reopenings? So, you know, which sectors and when, or what will be the data used to tell us when non-essential retail, hospitality, live events, and of course, by the way, aviation as well, which is really struggling at the moment, like others. So I think that idea of, if I'm a business owner, I want to come away from today with a bit more clarity about, if not precise dates, the sequencing and the evidence that allows me to open. And I finally have got something to plan against. Number two, coordination and consistency across nations. So we know that the nations are doing this differently, but can there be some signs about coordination and alignment on the roadmap forward? You know, we've had on these calls lots of businesses who've got either workers or customers on different devolved nations. That's been hugely confusing. And then thirdly, as I said, indication of financial support, which we may have to wait for in the budget. So I think that's at the high level. I think there'll be a lot of questions come out of today, which I'll come on to in a moment, but I think that's the high level ask.
And Tony, can I just understand one thing? Everyone, I'm sure, has been reading and listening over the weekend to what's expected. It seems as though there are two big decisions that are implicit in the reopening. I mean, beyond the one that you made clear, which is let's not go back, let's not have another lockdown. One is that it appears we are moving beyond regional tiering. And it also appears that we are having hospitalizations rather than infections become a key trigger point. And for businesses on both of those fronts, that makes a profound difference, I imagine, to the way you plan if you're a business operating England-wide. It also makes a difference if you're imagining that we're going to be reopening even if there are still quite significant infection rates, and how you plan for sickness and sick pay. And I just wondered whether you've got any thinking on that. You said there are many questions. Those are just two. I know there'll be many others that are on your mind or you're hearing from business as well.
Yeah, well, look, I think that reflects the growing learning and maturity that all of us are reaching throughout the crisis. And I think, maturity number one, regionalization sort of made a lot of sense, but in practice became hugely complicated and probably quite divisive. So if you can do without it, for businesses, for citizens, for families in particular, all the better. So I think, assuming that's supported by medical evidence, it's definitely, I think, an improvement. Secondly, really interesting what you say about, a certain tolerance for living with the virus, for living with infections, but really focusing on hospitalization in the NHS. And that's why today's discussion about workplace testing is so important. I think we've said for a long time that we need to learn to live with the virus, and in particular to work with the virus. And when Dido was on, of course, one of the things she told us was, even post-vaccination, workplace testing is going to be a fact of life to keep an eye on the virus and to keep an eye on new variants. So I think you're absolutely right about that. But just a couple of things that I think are going to come up. I'm already going to tell you what I think I'm going to be saying this time tomorrow, although there'll be others. And by the way, just a heads up for everybody, we are doing a special on the roadmap tomorrow morning. So not Wednesday, tomorrow morning at 10, full CBI cast. Let me give you a prediction. We may be surprised, but let me give you a prediction about some of the things we're going to be raising, I suspect. The first one is the financial support piece. So now that we've seen a long phased, a slow phased report, what does it mean for the JRS? What does it mean for business rates and VAT deferral? And that will be, of course, the main focus of the budget. Secondly, financial support for workplace testing. We may or may not get into this in the discussion, but one of the real problems we have with workplace testing at the moment is the difference in cost. You've got a very immature market where, somebody's paying £2 for a lateral flow, somebody's paying £20 for a lateral flow. Yeah. And I think we need to think quite hard, and maybe the Chancellor needs to help us work out how we can study that market. But then there are going to be a lot of detailed questions that will enable the reopening to succeed, to give it real momentum. And we've talked about some of them before. The interplay between workplace testing and the track and trace, which Ben might talk about, and also vaccination. How does that work together? Detailed workplace guidance. We've been pushing base for quite a few weeks now. We're not quite there yet on reissuing guidance, even if it's the same guidance, or is it the same guidance? Are we going to have 1 meter? Are we going to have 2 meters? What are going to be some of the guidance for different sectors as they reopen? Does that stay the same? Those are the questions that businesses are asking now. And of course, another one which we've talked about a lot here is, can you mandate, if you can't mandate vaccination, can you mandate workplace testing, or in what settings can you do so? So already I think businesses are asking those kinds of questions. Now, let's be clear, the Prime Minister isn't going to get to those today, but I think we'll want to move to those really quickly thereafter so that we can have momentum to this reopening rather than confusion.
Well, in that same thread then, Tony, do you want to talk about the budget? Sort of what business wants from it, and where you think the Chancellor's head is at the moment?
Yeah, look, I think we need 3 things from the budget in very broad terms. The first one is extended support for the economy, and a belief in the principle that the nature of that support is connected to the restrictions. So as you know, in our budget submission, we've asked the Chancellor to extend furlough and the related reliefs till the end of June, and then to taper thereafter. So the obvious, what the exact timescale of that is depends on the exact timescale set out by the Prime Minister today. So that's number one. Keep supporting the economy, finish that bridge to the other side, finish the job. Number 2, we need a budget to stimulate business investment, right? We need to stimulate growth and recovery rather than stifle it. So in the round, there's lots of rumors about what the Chancellor may or may not do in the budget, but in the round, do we come out of this budget with greater business confidence and greater incentives for business to invest? Because the only way you deal with the long-term fiscal hangover of COVID-19 is by having a growing economy. So this needs to be a budget for, short-term, immediate recovery, confidence, and investment. And then finally, can we have a bit of a framework for long-term growth of our economy? We've talked about having an economic vision. I think the Chancellor's in the same place. Can we take a view now, a sort of 10-year view about post-Brexit, post-COVID, in a net zero world, how Britain's going to thrive in the world? So look, I think, probably in descending order, the headlines will be around extended financial support, no doubt. Then I think, how are we stimulating business confidence and investment rather than doing the opposite? And in the long run, what's the framework for growth? Because that too actually allows businesses to have the confidence to invest.
And Tony, just what do you think is the role of the CBI here, in that there'll be a lot of people who are trying to make a judgment, if you like, for the Chancellor about the balance of debt and taxes and spending. On the other hand, there's also a bunch of people who say, look, actually, we really need people to focus on, we had a conversation the other day about reforming business rates, or about capital gains tax or corporation tax or even VAT application. There are a bunch of really specific taxes and, as you say, kind of investment support. Where do you think sort of the balanced priorities is for you and for the CBI on this?
Look, I think this is going to become the fiscal argument of the next few years, isn't it? Which is, what's the right mix in trying to create sustainable long-term public finances between growth, between tax rises, and between spending cuts, right? I think everybody gets that in the long run, we're going to need to deal with the debt that comes as a result of the crisis. Our very firm view, as expressed to the Chancellor in writing and personally, is now is not the time to raise taxes. But the most important thing above all is that we find ways in this budget to stimulate business investment. Only through growth and through growth in our economy can we even get near the levels of debt and deficit we have to get near. And the better we do on growth, the less we have to do in tax rises and spending cuts. Now, you could pick individual taxes or individual rates, and it looks like he's going to defer business rates till the autumn, which is a really big shame, because I think there's a lot of businesses suffering right now from what we think are unfair business rates. But I think in the round, we have to be building a competitive tax regime that's predictable, that rises only with growth, and probably above all, that stimulates business investment, because otherwise we just have an economy of household spending and government spending, and nobody wants that. The only way to overcome the long-term fiscal challenges we have is to get the economy growing and businesses investing really quickly. So for me, that's the test of the budget. Obviously short-term financial support to get us to the other side, and then in the round, I won't talk about individual taxes, in the round, are we stimulating businesses to invest, or are we stifling them and making them uncertain? That's a huge judgment call, I think, for the Chancellor.
Okay, Tony, thank you. Well, let's turn to the subject of the day, test and trace at work. I'm going to bring Ben Stimpson in a moment. Ben, thank you so much for joining us, and Lisa too. But Tony, just to give us a flavour of it, what are you hearing from businesses around test and trace? I imagine there's quite a high level of enthusiasm in principle. I guess it's the application in practice that's the issue.
Yes, I think that's right. So a few weeks ago, so the data will be a bit out of date, we did a survey of essentially who was doing workplace testing, and 85% of businesses weren't. And a lot of them were keen on it, but were confused about how to get started, or didn't feel confident, or were worried about price. Interestingly, I ran a retail roundtable of some of our retail members 10 days ago. And what was very interesting was the variability in sort of adoption of workplace testing. So some of the retailers were running voluntary schemes, and some of them were getting 40% participation, others were getting 90% participation. And what I thought was most heartening was that where there was high levels of participation by the workforce in workforce testing, there were much higher levels of comfort, a stronger sense of well-being and safety and camaraderie and participation and engagement at work. And so I think that's really the big message. So workplace testing is good from a health and virus combat point of view, but it's also, if the first sort of examples from some of the firms that are doing it are to be believed, it also gives a much stronger sense of security, safety, confidence amongst workers. And that's what I think makes it really interesting. Apart from the fact that we know, medically and scientifically, it's going to be an important part of our lives for the next year or two.
Tony, thank you. Lisa, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but I'm going to start with Ben Stimpson, if I might. Ben, I have to say, when I heard you were joining and that you were the Chief Customer Officer of NHS Test and Trace, I thought that was a fascinating reflection itself on the posture and mindset of Test and Trace. I know you're deep in the weeds of this, but I wanted to start. A lot of businesses on the call will just want to understand what are the requirements of business and what's available in terms of government support. So are you happy to start there?
Yes, of course. Thanks, James. So, I mean, absolutely, as Tony says, what is becoming increasingly clear is that workplace testing is a key tool in living with the virus, at least for the foreseeable future. And so what we've put in place is a program, and it's got headline level two parts, really. So one is for organizations that have got more than 50 employees, where there is government funded support, effectively the tests available for free, and a program to set up that testing within that workplace. There is another route for organizations who are smaller, below 50 employees, and that is primarily around using what we call community testing sites. So sites within the community run by local authorities, where it's possible to get tested on site before you go to work, or if you're a contractor, before you head to whichever site you're working on that day. So both routes are available. As a quick headline to Tony's point around where we were 3 weeks ago versus where we are now, we have got 1,300 live sites across England, and we've got 13,000 businesses who are going through the process of getting set up to do that testing on their sites. So I don't think we're lacking in interest, and I hope that sort of more today will be keen to come on board. It is now about getting those sites set up and ensuring the support's there for those businesses to run the testing as they want to.
And so how many did you say already set up?
1,300, 1,300.
And can we do each of your strands separately? Can we start with those businesses that are under 50? Because there are a number of, in fact, there's some people already on the call, Ben, who are saying, well, we don't understand what happens if you're a small or medium-sized company with employees of fewer than 50. You're saying you should then go to one of the local testing sites?
Yes, so at a very basic level, there's a postcode checker on the .gov site. You can look up which are the nearest sites to either yourself or your employee can do the same, or indeed contractors use it quite significantly as well. Go to that local testing site. The testing is available for free. It's a very quick process. It takes no more than 30 minutes, including getting the result. And then the day can continue if you're heading off to work.
And that's, but so I understand, that's a lateral flow test at what's typically a PCR site. It's a site that's usually doing PCR tests.
No, so these community testing sites are primarily lateral flow focused. So they are asymptomatic, in the jargon, they're asymptomatic testing sites, right, which we have set up through local authorities. Local authorities are deciding where they think the right locations are, and they are running according to what their community needs are. But it is asymptomatic testing funded by central government.
Oh, so I understand. And then can you, if you're a local business, have any mechanism of booking sort of on block for people coming through? Everyone books individually into those community testing sites. So
it's booking individually and ensuring that the employee has organised the test they need for that day or that week. Obviously, it's slightly different model for the larger organisations where the testing is on site, but in terms of using community testing, it's booking individually.
All right. And is there any expectation, Ben, that the testing threshold will lower, that you'll begin to operate at companies with fewer than 50 employees?
Do you mean in terms of being able to set up their own sites at less than 50? No, at the moment, that's not my expectation. I think the model that says we can support larger sites or larger organisations getting testing sites set up, you need a scale of above 50 to make sense to establish it and to the logistics of getting the test to that site. So it's a much better way to run it, to use community sites for smaller organisations.
Okay, all right. So, well, then let's turn to those 1,300 rising to 13,000. Tony mentioned the issue about price. Can you just talk us through the economics of it for businesses? What's the price and what's the government support available?
So there are, as Tony was referencing, there are some businesses who are purchasing their own tests, and I think that was the point Tony was making in terms of range of pricing. What we have available is government-funded and indeed government-approved tests that we are confident in terms of the reliability of. So sort of, I guess my encouragement there is using the test that we're providing. The tests are free of charge currently until the end of March, which I know is a big question that many of your members and others I've spoken to have asked. That's the current position, but well understood that creates an issue for many businesses. And so absolutely in focus to make sure that is resolved in the very near future. The cost to the business is some very small level of staffing, so somebody to run the location where the testing is taking place, and there is some setup in terms of, obviously having a space, having an area in which to do it. But beyond that, the costs are primarily borne centrally by government.
And the expectation, just on that point about subsidy until the end of March, either at that point the expectation is that businesses will have to start buying in their own lateral flow tests, or without sort of forcing you to make a policy announcement, Ben, the government is going to have to make a decision on extending public funding of the lateral flow tests. Is that right?
Yeah, so at the moment the position is till the end of March, and a bit as both Tony and I have said, really, what all of us are needing to judge is how can we believe the asymptomatic testing is a powerful tool and will be for a significant time in terms of managing living with this virus. Yeah. How we test and trace, and obviously government more widely, get the incentives right for that testing to take place and the costs to be shared, borne in the right way, is very much a live question, which, as I say, needs to be answered in the near future to help businesses have certainty as they're planning.
Okay, can I just want to, before I come to these, I just want to raise a couple of points that have been made as you were speaking, Ben. One is, Toby Abbott has raised this point, and I know it's going to be one of those things that many people have been thinking about, who writes this. As an office-based business with around 300 employees who can and have been mainly working from home, should we use the government-supplied lateral flow test as part of our risk management to test those employees, around 5%, who cannot work from home due to issues such as mental health, unsuitable workspace, etc.? What about the people who are not working from home?
So if I'm understanding the question right, so the focus of the current government offer is on those who have to leave home to go to work, because beyond that, yes, the regulations are obviously we should all work at home if we are able to do so. So that exactly is the focus. We believe that's a population of around 9 million people at the moment who are having to leave home to go to work. And so if a proportion of your workforce is needing to come into the office, as you say, for the reasons that you shared there from Tony, then absolutely this is what should be in place, and we will enable to be in place for that proportion of the workforce. I think if the question is, if it's more or less than 50, but I've got 300 employees overall, the position would be, if you're a large employer with 300 employees and more than 50 of them have to come into the office, then it would be, we would support setting up the asymptomatic testing on site. If it's less than that, as I said earlier, it would be using the community testing sites.
Right, okay. And there's not, and I understand it, I mean, one of the questions, Ben, is about mandatory testing for people who are coming into the workplace. What's the government's current position on that?
So the position around this testing program that I'm describing is it's entirely voluntary. And so it is entirely at the choice of the employee as to whether they participate, and indeed the employer as to whether they want to set up a site. It's our experience, a bit as Tony was alluding to, is that the sort of while it does, of course, need to be positioned carefully, what we've found is actually that generally employees are keen to participate because of the reassurance it gives them if they are having to be on site to work.
All right, but I'm going to come back to you because, as you can imagine, there are a host of questions. But I want to bring in Lisa on exactly that point. Lisa Curlett-Harrison, you're the security partner at RWE, and you're one of those 1,300, aren't you? You've got a testing program that's already set up in the business. So will you tell us a little bit about how it works and some of the points that Ben was just raising about the eagerness or otherwise of colleagues to participate?
Yes, of course. And maybe I'll give you a little bit of background on RWE, because we are quite a diverse organisation. We employ 2,600 people across the UK and have 80 generation sites, including both conventional and renewables generation, with our main offices being in Swindon, London and Coventry. With around 9,500 megawatts of generation capacity, we generate enough power for around 10 million homes. So we provide a really important role in the security of supply of energy. So we do see it as being really important to ensure that our employees who do require to go into the workplace are safe, and therefore we have the robust measures in place. Our COVID testing currently is available for a selected group of employees, so those whose role in the organisation cannot be done at home. And that includes our operational teams at our offshore renewable sites, for example, as well as the critical teams at our HQ in Swindon. Our testing currently varies between the sites. The reason being that we need to make sure that it meets the needs of the business. And the overarching requirement is that the programme is effective and accurate, while striking the kind of balance between not eating into the productive working time. Since June 2020, we have been running a mixture of pre-quarantine testing processes for our workplace for those who are accessing our offshore renewable sites. That includes a combination of PCR and lateral flow testing, and that's entirely delivered by third-party suppliers, and they run the entirety of the testing programme. Since January the 7th this year, we have been operating lateral flow testing at our headquarters in Swindon, and this has been done in partnership with the Department for Health and Social Security, and it's mainly targeted at the critical team who are responsible for managing the data and information essential to dispatch the electricity the company produces across the UK onto the grid. But as I said, that's been done in partnership with the Department for Health and Social Care, as Ben has been highlighting. Both types of testing have been running really well.
And Lisa, I'm intrigued about that because we've read so much about vaccine hesitancy. What's the story on testing hesitancy? Once the testing program is in place within the company, within RWE, are you finding pretty much everyone participates, or are there some people who are saying thanks but no thanks?
We're actually, the employees have been really supportive of the testing, and I feel it's because they feel it provides greater reassurance from their own personal perspective as well as the environment within the workplace. And it does add to the kind of robust measures that we currently have in place as well. It's actually a more robust measure. The challenge is around the accuracy and the reliability of the testing, because there were some questions prior to introducing the lateral flow testing at our headquarters in Swindon. There were some questions about how we can ensure the reliability. Some people had been reading the reports based on the Liverpool trials at the earliest stage. However, what we did realise quite quickly was that we needed to have dedicated resources who were trained and competent in overseeing the testing, because it is self-administered, and depending on how well the user administers that test, that will either increase or decrease the kind of reliability of the results. So we did some challenge. Sorry.
Well, just on that point, what's your frequency of testing?
So the lateral flow testing at the headquarters in Swindon is 3 times per week, Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, and we run that from 9 o'clock in the morning to 12 o'clock. And everybody has a 10-minute appointment for the testing to be carried out.
Each day. So each person who comes into the Swindon office has 3 tests a week.
Within that team, they can, depending on their shift pattern, they can have 2 to 3 tests per week. And I think that's where, you know, I really commend my colleagues for taking part in the testing program as well, because it can be a bit uncomfortable, maybe just a little bit more than a little uncomfortable. And that's where I really commend the colleagues to continue to take part in it. And the reason, and the fact that they do continue to take part in it 2 to 3 times per week does show that they see that as part of their responsibility as well. And it also helps us to ensure that the workplace is a more safe environment for them. So yeah, so I think that's.
And one of the questions from businesses I see is people saying, right, but in the event that someone comes in and they do test positive, what are the financial implications for them individually?
For them individually, if they require to isolate at home, and we have had a number of instances where teams have to isolate at home, they wouldn't be financially penalised at all, and that will all just be caught up within the HR procedures.
Okay, Lisa, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but I want to just get Ben. Sorry, you had something to say, and I had something to ask you. Why don't you go first?
I've never used this system before. I don't know how to raise my hand on the technology, so I'm doing it in reality. I just wanted to come in, if I may, on the point around the reliability of the test, which Lisa makes a really important point around, which is partly obviously about the sort of public conversation around the reliability of the test, which I think has had an impact on the way employees have seen them. And so great to hear, Lisa, the way you sort of reassured them about the reliability of the test when used properly. I was just going to share, I think there are 2 reasons why these tests are particularly useful in a workplace context. They're useful elsewhere as well. One is that they are extremely good at picking up those with the virus when people are highly infectious. So they are very good tests around the infectiousness of an individual, which clearly in a workplace context is really critical. It's of course true, and many on the call will know this, that relative to the PCR test, they detect fewer cases where the viral load is lower, but at the higher levels where there is the highest risk of infecting others, these are very good tests at picking up those results. And then the second point, which is I think particularly relevant in a workplace context, is that they have a very low level of false positives. So they don't say that somebody's got the virus when they actually haven't. And again, in terms of operational reliability and consistency, not having false positives is clearly very important. So for those 2 reasons, while the debate I'm sure will continue to rage for some time, we're very confident in terms of the value of the test and the role the tests play in a workplace and other contexts.
Ben, can we just let it rage on for another minute or 2? Because there's one, I appreciate your point about false positives. The concern is around false negatives. And the reason I asked Lisa about how many times a week are RWE testing is this concern that it gives false reassurance that some people who actually do have COVID-19 don't, and that they then behave in a way that actually risks increasing infection. So do you have advice to companies on the frequency of tests that are required to at least try and offset that risk?
Yeah, so the scheme that we are running and supporting businesses with offers twice weekly testing, and we're confident that will avoid the situation you described, James, where somebody may decide to sort of they are not at risk when they actually are. You will pick that up in the second test very quickly and be able to act on it. So it is about the regular habit of testing. And this is a wider point, to be honest, about how all of us are going to unfortunately have to live with the virus. Is this regular habit of testing is the way to make sure that all of the tools, which to a degree are imperfect, but the more regularly they are used, the less they carry the risk you describe, which is people carrying on behaving as if they're negative when they're not.
And I can commit to that as well, because that was one of our concerns prior to launching with the lateral flow testing. Was that it would result in a behavioural change amongst our colleagues, and they potentially would then not follow the hygiene regimes, and would also not follow social distancing. But in reality, we haven't seen that at all. And I believe part of the reason for that is around the communication and constantly reinforcing the message that this is only one tool in our toolbox as such. And the social distancing, the hygiene measures, they all add up, and each of them on top of the other makes all of the measures more robust and creates that COVID secure environment. But I think communications is key in managing that risk and just reinforcing that this is a point in time, and a negative test isn't to be seen as a green light for the person to carry on as the business as usual, but that a negative test is that kind of red light where they isolate, and then we do the contact.
And Lisa, do you know the position, maybe Ben, you may know this. Let's say that the four of us all work in the same company. The company makes the decision to introduce workplace testing. It makes the investment, as Ben says, of having someone or a couple of people to operate it. Everyone's expected to show up, but I choose not to, either because I don't like the discomfort or I've got some principled aversion to companies' intrusion into my health. What's the position of the company? Is the company required to continue to employ me? Is there any sanction the company can have against my refusal to participate? What measures are there? Or is it's not only voluntary for businesses to participate, it's voluntary for all individuals without sanction?
Yeah, so Lisa may want to comment with particular experience, but it is entirely voluntary, both for businesses and for employees. And as I say, our experience, what I've seen businesses doing, means that the way it's engaged, the way you engage with teams, the way you communicate, means that actually we get pretty high levels of take up, but no compulsion.
And then Lisa, I don't know whether you want to comment on this, but this is a sort of related question. And what happens if as more and more people get vaccinated, if people have got the have had the vaccine, or let's say the 2 jabs, at that point, what's your requirement on testing? If they come in and say, look, here's proof of my vaccination, do you still want them to be having the test?
As an organisation, yes, we would still be wanting to roll out the workplace testing. So we see that the workplace testing in our mind will continue alongside the rollout of the vaccination programme across the UK. And as it's already been mentioned on this call already, that will continue, if not for the whole of the year, the entirety of the year, for a great part of it. We've also, I would also say that we have registered RWE's interest with the Department for Health and Social Care for the current home testing or self-testing that they're currently developing. We do see that as being another key to encourage a more active return to the workplace, because that will be a future challenge to ourselves, because people will have adapted and be familiar and more comfortable working from home. So to encourage a more active return to the workplace, we do need other tools that can help support that. The self-testing or home testing would be part of that, but we would run that in parallel to the on-site testing that we're currently running as well. And again, that runs in parallel with the rollout of the vaccination programme, because we're restricted as an organisation. We can't ask people to tell us whether they've been vaccinated. That's just not something as an organisation we can do. So we have to treat everybody until there's a high proportion of the population that has been vaccinated across the UK. We have to assume that none of our colleagues have been vaccinated.
Right. Okay, Lisa, thank you.
The only thing I was going to add to James is, I think, as what Lisa says is entirely right. The other point about the vaccine is, although there's data starting to emerge, we don't know its impact on transmission of the virus. And so this is why you will hear people like me talking about living with asymptomatic testing alongside the vaccine, because until we're really clear about what the vaccine does to transmission, this kind of testing, in fact, will become even more important, because symptoms will become suppressed by the vaccine.
But Ben, can I just say, listening to this, it's really interesting, and you know, to be fair, Lisa, it's really impressive hearing the way in which, you know, RW kind of takes this on and thinks about how to implement it. To be honest, though, as I listen to it, I think to myself, we could quite quickly emerge into a situation in which big businesses that have the resources, you know, financial and organizational, to implement systems like this, you know, take on lateral flow testing, but smaller companies and companies that are more financially pressured don't. I wondered how you're beginning to think about that, because we've had some people asking questions as you were speaking about, you know, how do we think about the costs of covering people for the time taken to go to these tests, or for travel time to go to these tests. And you can just feel in those questions smaller businesses that are already feeling the strain, thinking, this is another financial ask of us, and we're under enough pressure as it is.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a very, very live conversation. So, and I suppose I would say, before I inherited the quirky job title you referenced earlier, I used to work in retail, and so I am acutely aware of the complexities, actually, whether you're large or small, organisation, of managing these kind of systems and these things that will inevitably take time. And as you say, you get into debates about who pays, or discussions about who pays for the time. And how you then manage sort of rotas and shifts accordingly. And if you've got workforces, again, whether large or small, that are working in a varied pattern across the week, these things are inevitably more complex than perhaps an office-based solution. So that's understood and being worked through, I guess, is what I would say. Between sort of smaller and larger organisations, what I would come back to is the community testing offer, which is the solution to not needing to set anything up yourself as a smaller organisation. That is our answer to it. And clearly, as the year continues, making sure that we've got the right answer for smaller organisations, and equally we're managing the balance, I said earlier, between who's bearing the costs of this, is what we've got to get right.
Okay, Ben, thank you very much. And Lisa too. Tony, I just want to come back to you just to give you the last word on this. It's really striking. When we started, when we had the first of these calls at the beginning of January, one of the thoughts was about the extent to which business will be, to use your phrase, in service of the nation. And actually, practically speaking, I can't remember a moment in my lifetime where you've had business so directly involved in effect, public health policy. And so I just wondered what you think of this.
Yeah, well, look, what's interesting about this conversation, and by the way, how great Lisa and Ben were, what's interesting about this conversation is that, James, you, in about 25 minutes, started to ask the questions that employers are all asking, right? It doesn't take long to start to see that implementing this stuff is really hard. And not only is there a gap between big and small, even between big companies. We had a construction sector roundtable, and on some of these questions, 2 large companies doing completely the opposite stuff. And by the way, a lot of discord, because everybody knows what everyone else is doing, and why is everybody, and people lose faith in the system. And I think it's precisely why we think government now need to have answers or principles, or even be transparent about what we do know and do advise versus what we don't and what's for discretion. Because I think if we've got a consistent approach to this, you're going to have a high level of reassurance. It's one of those very rare areas where actually companies want government guidance, want government to help set standards so that they can do the right thing and employees can know it's the right thing. And obviously government can't regulate every single piece of this, but government's role in standard setting, in having worked up examples and clear guidance about what we know and don't know, where there's discretion, where there isn't, I think will, give businesses the chance to do exactly what you described, James, because they all want to do what you describe. They want to make their workers feel at ease. They want to make customers feel reassured, whether or not that's sort of B2C businesses or B2B businesses. And I think government can really play a role in the next few weeks at essentially setting the standards and principles and guidance for how to do this. And I think businesses will be actually really pleased to have that kind of scene setter that will enable them to move forward with confidence.
All right, well, Tony, thank you for that. A big thank you to Lisa Kerlett-Harrison from RWE and Ben Stimson from NHS Test and Trace. As Tony mentioned, he and the CBI gang are back tomorrow to give you a roadmap readout. Please join for that. But for this morning, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Have a very good day and a good week. Thanks so much.
Thank you.